Okay, so this is again as presented as part of Hawaiʻi Invasive Species Awareness Month. It's one of a series of activities. There's webinars happening throughout the month, in-person events and volunteer activities. The theme for this year's HiSAM, Hawaiʻi Invasive Species Awareness Month, is Who Protects Hawaiʻi? You do. Invasive species are everyone's kuleana. And we're highlighting the collective efforts of Aloha Aina throughout the state. There's a full list of activities and events and webinars. If you just Google HiSAM 2024, it's on the DLNR website. So every year, HiSAM offers us a chance to tune in to what's happening around Hawaii with invasive species and efforts to address them. Some of these pests are widespread, some are early on in their invasion, and there's programs designed to address them at all stages, but ultimately the task is too big to be done alone. So we depend and appreciate the collaboration with our community and other programs and your time for tuning in. It all starts with just a sense of kilo, observation, paying attention to what's happening around us, and then sharing our observations. So thank you again for taking the time to tune in today. It's going to be a fantastic presentation. Monte Tudor-Long will be talking about the ants of Hawaii. Monte himself is a keen observer of the world around him, and we're very lucky his attention is turned to ants. Monte joined MISC as part of our Koki field crew in 2015. He has a bachelor's of environmental science from the University of California at Santa Cruz. But his career up to that point had led him to working in credit unions and he had always been a bird watcher, though, and he was ready for a new path. So he joined our little fire ant crew when that became a reality. And it turns out that his experience with numbers and processes was essential to data entry. And the attention to detail aligned perfectly to attention and concentration required to differentiate between the different species of ants. He is currently MISC's invasive ant early detection and rapid response technician. It's a task that involves identifying thousands of ants each month and entering mountains of data. And for some reason, he really likes this. His fascination with ants is thoroughly contagious. In working with him, I found myself more tuned into the world at my feet and just below the surface. And he's incredibly patient. He's willing to talk to anybody about ants and identify whatever is brought to him, even if it's the most common ant in Hawaii. He's always teaching others and sharing what he's learned. And in his spare time, this is how passionate he is about ants. He's working on a book about the ants of Hawaii. So just a little bit of record keeping. The webinar is being recorded for airing later. And if you have any questions you need to come up, go ahead and add them to the Q&A. If we have any technical difficulties, please stay on. Chuck is our tech support person, and we'll hopefully keep everything going. Our internet can be a little bit spotty at our location, so hopefully it all holds out for the next hour. Okay, so without further ado, let me just take a quick Okay, go ahead, Monte, if you want to go ahead and get started.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me. Again, my name is Monte Tudor-Long. I am the Invasive Ant Early Detection Rapid Response Technician for the Maui Invasive Species Committee. And today we are going to be talking about all the ants of Hawaii. So, when you think of ants in Hawaii, I bet this is the sort of image that comes to mind. Ants in my kitchen, ants in the cat's food dish. Sorry, I just suddenly thought I might be muted, but I'm guessing I'm not. Sorry. Sorry, this is my first time. Okay, ants in the kitchen, ants in the cat's food dish. This is what you think of when you think of ants in Hawaii. And I imagine you might think, if you've seen one ant, you've seen them all. But the fact is, there's a huge diversity of ants in Hawaii and around the world. And that's one of the points of today's talk, is to discuss ant diversity. These are the goals for today's talk. I'm going to talk about ant diversity. I'm going to talk about native ants. What makes an ant native versus invasive? We're going to talk about the ants in Hawaii and categorize them. I call them the good, the bad, and the ugly. Then we're going to start wrapping up. I'll talk a little bit about ant identification and a little bit about collecting ants, reporting ants, and other invasive species. All right, so for the next 45 minutes, we're going to be talking about all the ants of Hawaii. But before we switch to ants, I want to talk a little bit about mammals to illustrate some of the diversity questions. Now, I imagine most of the people listening to the sound of my voice today are themselves a mammal. And I think our bias as mammals is that we look at mammals like as diverse as the Hawaiian hoary bat on the left, the giraffe on the right, and say, wow, mammals are incredibly diverse. Well, I'm here to tell you that ants are even more diverse and more ancient, and they've been diversifying longer than mammals. And the only reason this isn't common knowledge to the average person is because with your eyes, you can't really see ants very well. You're not crawling on the ground of the forest studying their behavioral and biological differences. And so if you get anything out of this talk, I want it to be that the ants are incredibly diverse group of animals. And to pound this point home a little bit more, let's zero in on primates. Now, on the left here are two primates, and they are virtually indistinguishable. However, the one on the left is my boss. The one on the right is a South American monkey. And though they are superficially quite similar, they in fact diverged from a common ancestor about 40 million years ago. Look at the two examples on the right. We got two ants. These two ants, their most common ancestor was something like 80 million years ago. These ants have been diversifying for so much longer than mammals have been. And that has led to an incredible diversity amongst ants. Now, before we get too much further, I want to talk about some definitions. We've got native ants, we have tramp ants, and we have invasive ants. What is a native ant? It is an ant that is living in the ecosystem where it originally evolved over the last whatever many millions of years. It is serving some vital function in the ecosystem in which it lives. A tramp ant, an ant becomes a tramp when it has been picked up and moved through some sort of human-mediated vectoring, moved from its native ecosystem into an alien ecosystem. And it is in that alien ecosystem, it has established itself. We call that a tramp ant. And then an invasive ant is that subset of tramp ants that are causing all sorts of problems in their new environment. Okay, so backing up a little bit, most of the world's ants are native ants. I want to emphasize this. If you look at that pie chart, that tiny wedge of ants is that percentage of ants that are tramps. We have roughly 20,000 species of ants on planet Earth. And only 200 or 300 of them have ever managed to tramp themselves to another location. And of those tramp ants, only about 10% of those are really qualify to be called invasive. So math, it comes out to about 1 out of every 1,000 ant species on planet Earth is an invasive ant. And so most ants are native. Most ants are doing what they evolved to do in their ecosystems. They're not invading your kitchen. So again, not all tramp ants are invasive. And I use a capital I when I say that, invasive. When we're talking about invasive species and invasive ants especially, those species meet one of these criteria. Either they are causing significant harm to native ecosystems. They're interfering with the flora and fauna of a native natural ecosystem, or it's a species that is causing significant economic harm. It is interfering with agriculture, tourism, and other parts of our economy. Or number 3, it just has a really negative impact on the way of life of the people who live in the area. Now, as I bet you can imagine, a lot of invasive species check all 3 of those boxes. And just to emphasize the environmental impact of invasive ants in Hawaii, here are just 4 papers that focus on the impacts of invasive ants in Hawaii and around the Pacific. All right, so moving on to all the ants of Hawaii, but maybe I really should be saying all the ants in Hawaii, because there are no ants that really are of Hawaii. all the ants in Hawaii today are introduced ants. They were brought here by people. Today, we know of 68 species that are established in the Hawaiian Islands. When did they get here? It would appear that all of these ants got here after European contact in the late 1700s. We don't know for sure because no one was writing scientific papers about them. The first scientific paper about ants in Hawaii was published in 1879 by Frederick Smith, the famed entomologist. He wrote about 7 species that were known to be in the Hawaiian Islands at that time. And if we only had 7 species, that would be great. But since then, we have been acquiring ants at a steady pace. In fact, we get a new ant species established in Hawaii every 2.5 years. So that it's gone from those 7 species in the 1870s to 68 species today. And as you can see, that curve is not showing any signs of leveling off. All right, so the ants that we do have here in Hawaii, I have separated them into several categories. I call them invasive ants, nuisance ants, and benign ants, or possibly even beneficial. And then a few ants that we don't know what category they go into yet. These categories are a bit arbitrary. I made them up myself. Not everybody, I'm sure, would agree with me on all these categories. Smart people can disagree on this. And the fact of the matter is, we don't know the answers to some of these questions, but as a jumping off point, we can arrange these ants along a spectrum from truly invasive to the other end of the spectrum where they seem to be not causing much harm at all. All right, so these 4 types of ants. This pie graph divides them up. The blue wedge are the invasive ants. The red wedge are what I call nuisance ants. A big yellow wedge are the benign ants. And then there's the to be determined ants. But first, I want to focus on the highly invasive ants. We have 4 highly invasive species of ants in Hawaii. Now, several years ago, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature wrote up a list of the world's 100 worst invasive species, plants and animals. On that list of 100 species, there were 5 species of ants. Hawaii has the first 4 of those ants. We have the African big-headed ant, the Argentine ant, the yellow crazy ant, and the little fire ant. These 4 species are horribly invasive and are all present in Hawaii. The 5th one, the red imported ant, we do not have, and hopefully we never get, but we're on the lookout. So these 5 species, first one, the African big-headed ant. This was on that first list of species printed in 1879, at which point it was already considered widespread. This is our first truly invasive ant, the first ant that started causing horrible destruction in Hawaii's native ecosystems. My hero, R.C.L. Perkins, in the 1890s, when he was a youngster, started studying the insects and birds of Hawaii. He was the first one to really notice the impacts of this ant. He was a big fan of Hawaii's native beetles. He described many, many insects new to science. And during the 1890s, he watched this ant advance through the lowland forests, native forests of Hawaii, and watched all his favorite beetles go extinct in this ant's wake. This ant is horribly, horribly destructive. Today, it is the most common ant in the state. It is ubiquitous below about 3,000 feet elevation. This is the ant that is most likely in your kitchen. Above about 3,000 feet, it starts petering out because it gets too cold. So it does not invade our native high elevation forests. Unfortunately, we also have the Argentine ant. The Argentine ant is horribly invasive throughout the mainland US. When it got to Hawaii, it was be perfectly happy to live down at the seashore. However, it doesn't get along with that first species, the African big-headed ant. And so the big-headed ant has pushed the Argentine ant up to higher elevations. The Argentine ant can tolerate the cold weather. And so now this ant is found only above about 3,000 feet elevation, primarily, if not exclusively, on Maui and the Big Island. And of course, this ant is causing all sorts of destruction in our native ecosystems in the higher elevations. Next, the yellow crazy ant. I might argue that this is the worst invasive ant in Hawaii. This is a truly horrible ant. It causes all sorts of destruction to our native arthropods, but also to our ground nesting seabirds. This ant does not bite, it does not sting, but it sprays an acid. And when it gets into a bird nest, it's horrifying. The bird on the left is a healthy shearwater chick. Shearwaters in Hawaii nest on the ground. On the right is a horribly, horribly maimed chick. This chick was attacked repeatedly by thousands of yellow crazy ants as it was developing. And so its soft parts, its eyes, its bill, its feet were sprayed repeatedly with the acid of the yellow crazy ant. Of course, this bird is not going to survive. And so yellow crazy ants are horribly destructive to our ground nesting seabirds. Moving on to little fire ants. This ant has been in the headlines. This is the most recent invader of those horribly invasive ants and is the only one where eradication is even a possibility. This ant is now found on 4 islands. On the Big Island of Hawaii, it is fairly widespread. Eradication is not on the table for Hawaii Island, but containment measures are underway. And so there are things that can be done. Maui, I'm happy to say this ant is well under control. And on Oahu and Kauai, just recently, it has been popping up in more and more locations. And so the battle is really on those 2 islands. The state legislature, I understand, has recently dedicated more funding to the fight on those islands. And so hopefully we can make some good progress and stop the ant on those 2 islands. At the present time, it is not found on Molokai, Lanai, Koholalave, or Niihau, or the islands beyond that. Of course, I could talk all day about this ant, but we're going to move on. I want to point out, we have 2 species of fire ants in Hawaii, and this causes a lot of confusion for people. The tropical fire ant is huge by comparison, and it has been here since the 1800s. It was on that first list in 1879. A lot of people listening to me today have probably been stung by tropical fire ants. They are very common on the leeward shores of the islands. They like hot, sunny, dry locations like beach parks, dirt parking lots, the side of the road. They most commonly attack you on your feet when you stand on their nest. Little fire ants, by contrast, besides being minuscule in comparison, they thrive on the North Shore. They like hot, steamy, moist forests. And the most common encounter with little fire ants is down the back of your shirt. They fall out of the vegetation and they go down the back of your shirt. And again, I could talk for hours about those 2 species. But fun fact, the very first little fire ant ever detected in the United States was by an 11-year-old girl. And I point that out because I think sending your kids out into the yard to collect ants is a great activity. And we'll talk more about collecting and sending ants in for identification. Okay, lastly, of those first 5 ants is the red imported fire ant, also called Rifa. This ant is terrible. This is the ant in Texas and Florida and parts in between. We do not want this ant in Hawaii. And thank you to the Hawaii Department of Agriculture, who's kept it out of Hawaii so far. And let's hope we continue to have success because this ant is a true nightmare. All right, moving on. The next wedge is the nuisance ants. I put 18 ants in this category. That's about a quarter of the ants in Hawaii. And these ants, for the most part, sometimes they're annoying. Sometimes, if you get stung by tropical fire ants, that might ruin your morning. For the most part, these are not the kinds of ants that destroy economies. They don't make you move to another island. Some of these ants will get into your kitchen. Some of them, they'll be a little bit annoying in your garden, but for the most part, these ants are just annoying. Here are some examples. We've got the ghost ant. This is a super tiny ant. It moves incredibly fast, has a very pale gaster. That's the butt of the ant. They move so fast that often people see them and they don't even realize it's an ant. They're very annoying. They're hard to get rid of, but most of the time they stay out of the house. Little yellow ants, these do get in the house. They're so tiny that they can get into packages and jars of honey that seem to be completely sealed. And again, these are ridiculously tiny ants. They look a lot like little fire ants. So we call them LFA lookalikes. More LFA lookalikes, especially the one on the left. These are thief ants in the genus Solenopsis. These ants are tiny. They're about the size of little fire ants. They mostly don't come into the house. They occasionally will get in the cat's food dish. They don't seem to be causing a lot of drama. The one on the right is found sometimes in native forests, but studies to date are equivocal on as to how much damage they might be causing in the native forest. And then we've got flower ants. This is a very common ant, very common in gardens. They like flowers, and they like the honeydew secreted by aphids and whiteflies and that sort of thing. They're a slow-moving, bicolored ant. You may have encountered it in your yard. The head and the gaster are very, very dark, and it's paler in between. And again, this ant has been here a long time, since the late 1800s. And then there's this group of ants I call the bitey ants. These ants like to bite people. And when I say like to, they mostly are not aggressive. They just occasionally they get mixed up in your clothing and they will bite. The ant on the top right, number 3, is the destroyer ant. This ant is aggressive. There's no two ways about it. It will attack, it will bite, and it hurts. So that ant is really annoying, and maybe someday it'll graduate to that category of capital I invasive ants. Fortunately, it's not very widespread, so it doesn't impact a whole lot of people. I'm going to go on a tangent here to talk a little bit about the difference between a bite and a sting. These ants I call bitey ants. There's also the stinging ants. The fire ants are stinging ants. They sting you like a bee stings you, and they inject a venom. It's that venom that causes the drama in your skin. It causes the pustules, the itching, the rash, the heat sensation that makes you feel like you're on fire. The ants on this slide, they don't do that. They're biting you with their mouth parts. It hurts for a moment while they bite, and then it's over with. And so that's a difference that when someone's reporting a stinging or biting ant to me, I like to make that distinction because it helps me narrow down what ant we're talking about. Did it bite you or did it sting you? Okay, moving on. Carpenter ants. This is Hawaii's largest ant. These ants can be very annoying because they're huge and they run around quickly, and they often are in the house. They like to come out in the evenings, and it's creeps people out because they're so big. If you have a nuptial flight of the reproductives of this species, the queens and the males, those flights often happen in the evening. They will fly around your kitchen table or while you're trying to watch Netflix, and creeps people out. But again, they rarely bite, they don't sting, and they're actually not causing a lot of harm. They're just really annoying. Moving on to the benign ants. That wedge there is fully 50% of the ants. And again, this is my own arbitrary, categorization. Sorry. It's very possible that other people or future researchers will look back on this and say, Monty, you were incredibly naive to call any of these ants benign. They're all introduced. They couldn't possibly be having zero impacts. Certainly they're eating something, but whether they're eating our native soil fauna or whether they're just eating other invasive species, it's hard to say. There have been papers written arguing that certain ants are beneficial to Hawaii because of their predation on fly larvae. And so they help reduce the population of flies in Hawaii. Again, very smart people will have different opinions on this, but moving on, these 34 species I put in the benign category because they don't seem to be causing a lot of drama. The first two on this list, the trailing ants and the pennant ants, are the most visible of ants on this list. Again, they rarely bite or sting. People see them and get confused. They might think they're an invasive ant, but for the most part, they're not bothering anybody. We've got a bunch of mustache ants, sneaking ants, sickle-tooth ants, Pomeranian ants, and the quite amazing Van Zweilenberg's Dracula ant. The ant on the top right is the sickle-tooth ant. It is a very large ant. It's long, skinny, black, lives in tiny colonies of just 20 or 30 ants. And you may have seen them walking along a tree trunk or across a wall as they move their nests from one spot to another. Okay, some of these ants, some more details. This is a pennant ant in the genus Tetramorium. We have half a dozen of these. People see these and they immediately think fire ant because they're red. They're just a tropical fire ant look-alike species. They're not really causing any harm. The mustache ants, also known as pygmy snapping ants. These ants are adorable, in my opinion. They live in the soil for the most part. They snap their little mandibles close on springtails, which are an even tinier soil-dwelling insect-like creature. And we got 6 of these here in Hawaii. But again, they're rarely seen. They live in the soil. Sneaking ants. These are seen fairly commonly, but they live in low numbers. They really like highly disturbed areas, like football fields, soccer fields, that sort of thing. I don't find them much in forests. Some of them do like vegetation. Sometimes when I walk into the office, I find an ant crawling on my arm. It's almost certainly one of these ants that's fallen on my arm. They don't follow each other around. They're loners. But again, they don't bite or sting. So they're not causing a lot of trauma. Then we have a whole bunch of these primitive ants, Poneran ants, mini Poneran ants, also known as crypt ants. We have bunches of these. These are primitive soil-dwelling ants. They usually can barely see or they have no eye at all because they almost never see the light of day. They live in the soil, hunting little tiny soil critters. And then there's Van Zwallenberg's Dracula ant. I could talk for hours about this little ant. This is an incredibly rarely seen ant. We found one on Maui in 2022. It was incredibly exciting. It had never before been seen on Maui. It hadn't been seen in Hawaii since the 1940s, and it's only been found in 4 places on the planet. We don't even know where it's native. And there's only about 10 specimens in existence. The one ant that we collected on Maui 2 years ago is now residing in the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco, where researchers are planning to do some DNA work on it. And look at this ant. Look at its eyes. I can't even see an eye. This ant lives underground. It never comes to the light of day. It's called a Dracula ant because, get this, nobody feeds the queen. When she gets hungry, she crawls across her nest chamber. She punctures the skin of one of her larvae and sucks out its hemolymph, its little ant blood, and that's how she gets her food. The larvae don't seem to mind. They develop into well-adjusted adult ants, and they seem perfectly happy to provide food to their mothers that way. Super interesting. Okay, moving on to the TBD category. I put 12 ants in this category, the to be determined. It's very possible some of these ants will become horrible residents of Hawaii. For the most part, these are ants that are recent arrivals. So we don't quite know yet what their intents are. The first 2 ants on this list, the twig ants and the white-footed ants, seem like they ought to be invasive. White-footed ants around the world seem to be invasive in places, but I'm just not seeing that in my observations, at least here on the island of Maui. And graceful twig ants have a horrible, powerful sting. They're a huge ant. I find them in Kiave forests routinely, but I have yet to hear from another human being who's been stung by one. So it's to be determined. The rest of these ants, I think, are all fairly new to Hawaii. I got a few slides here about them. Okay, lost my train of thought. Sorry. New ants to Hawaii. We don't know much about them. I want to focus in on the most recent arrivals in Hawaii. We have, in the last 9 or 10 years, we have gotten 7 new species of ant. This first one, a trap jaw ant, is being found on the island of Kauai. It was found on the North Shore and seems, even after 7 or 8 years, to be restricted to the Princeville area. It's hard to say what's going to happen. Look at the jaws on that. It snaps those jaws so fast. It's one of the fastest moving body parts of any animal in the world. Number 2, we got another type of Poneran ant that showed up on Oahu. This ant is being seen and reported around Honolulu, but doesn't seem to be spreading. But yet, again, to be determined what sort of impact or distribution it might have. This is a white-footed ant. We have 4 species of white-footed ants, and in 2017 we added this number 4 to our list. Again, it doesn't seem to have spread beyond Oahu, and I've seen very few reports of it, so we don't quite know yet what it's going to be doing. The Indo-Malayan trailing ant was found in 2018. I have not heard anything about this ant since then, so I'm not even convinced it's still here. We added another mustache ant or pygmy snapping ant. This one was found on the Big Island in 2019. Thief ants, we had a new thief ant start appearing on Maui a few years ago. We don't know yet what species this is. It looks very similar to a species in Florida called Solenopsis zateki, but I don't think that's what it is. In this picture, it shows a queen on the top and a regular worker just below. And number 7, just a few months ago, a new species in the genus Trichomyrmex was found on Oahu. This genus is the one that also has the destroyer ant that I mentioned earlier. The destroyer ant was the aggressive biting ant. It's also known as Singapore ant or ninja ant. It's very possible that this close relative will become a problem, but again, it's way too early to know. Okay, those are 7 new species in Hawaii. I am going to completely shift gears and talk a smidge about ant identification. Identifying ants really requires a microscope. You can get close with your naked eye, but there are some features that you just cannot see to make the final distinctions of a species. So under a microscope, we're looking at features as obscure as the characterization of the tip of their antenna. We might be looking at the size of and placement of their eyes. Do they have a gigantic eye? Do they have a tiny eye? Do they have no eye? We're looking at strange bulges here and there, or slopes of their backsides, things like that. Here's an example of 2 very similar species that we have in Hawaii. Tetramorium insolens on the left, Tetramorium bicarinatum on the right. These 2 ants I call tropical fire ant lookalikes. The way to tell them apart, if you zoom in on the bottom pictures, the arrows are pointing to the petiole, the top rear right corner on the right of the petiole from this view. If you look back and forth, you can see they're shaped differently. That is the primary way you tell these 2 species apart. These 2 ants are big-headed ants. Phedola megacephala on the right is that African big-headed ant that started causing drama in the 1800s. We also have this other big-headed ant, Phydola fervens. To the naked eye, they're basically indistinguishable. Under the microscope, if you zoom in on their post-petiole, the ant on the left has a very symmetrical post-petiole, while the ant on the right has kind of a lopsided post-petiole. And then these 2 fire ants, Solenopsis invicta on the left is Rifa, the red imported fire ant that we do not yet have. On the right, Solenopsis geminata is our tropical fire ant, which is very common in Hawaii. We do not yet have Rifa, the one on the left, but they are virtually indistinguishable to the naked eye. Even under a microscope, they are very hard to tell apart. But let me tell you, if you've been stung by Solenopsis geminata, you know how bad that is. Solenopsis invicta is 20 times worse, 100 times worse. Telling them apart, if I zoomed in on their central section of their body, it's really hard to see this, but there's a little triangular flap on the ant on the right in that circle, and that flap is missing on the ant on the left. It's really hard to see, so I drew this little triangle around it. I don't know if that helps, but that little flap is how we tell them apart. Now, you may be asking, why do we care? These ants are virtually indistinguishable. A little tiny flap of skin is the only thing that separates them. Going back to what I was saying earlier about diversity, just because 2 species look superficially similar does not mean their behavior is the same. And I'll go back to our primate example. These 2 primates, virtually indistinguishable, but only one of them throws poop at me. Okay, moving on. You might be saying, but Monty, I don't carry a microscope with me everywhere I go. Is there any way I can identify ants in the field with my naked eye? Well, there is a way. It's a little bit of a crapshoot. It's You can get close, but not exact. But I created this little visual key to Hawaii's common ants. If you're interested in a copy, send me an email. I'll send it to you. And this can at least narrow it down a bit. And by just answering these three questions, what color is it? Is it polymorphic? And is it tiny? So the first question, what color is it? You have three possible answers. Is it a reddish yellow ant? Reddish yellow ants are very common in Hawaii. People get them confused with fire ants, but this helps narrow it down, red yellow ants. Or is it a brownish black ant? Or is it a bicolored ant? A fair number of ants, their gaster is much, much darker than the rest of the ant. The ant in the very center of this picture, this collage, the head is the really dark part. So bicolored would be your answer. Okay, second question is it polymorphic as opposed to monomorphic? Polymorphic meaning multiple sizes. If you look at the ants on the left here, if you have a big sample of ants, you'll see that they're not all the same size. They're either multiple sizes, and some ants it's just exactly two sizes, polymorphic. The examples on the right, no matter how many you have piled up, they're all basically the same exact size. Third question, is it tiny? Now, I know all ants are small, but some ants are insanely tiny. And these three photos show examples of ants at the same scale. Tiny ants, not tiny ants. Again, our example of fire ants on the bottom right. Tropical fire ant is the big one, little fire ant is the tiny one. So if you say the ant is tiny, that narrows things down. And we'll use that as an example. The photo on the left here, what I did is I pulled out those two tiny ants and blew them up, and you look at them and say, yes, those are reddish yellow ants. And I got enough of them in my sample that I can say they are monomorphic and they are tiny, which puts them into the category of these 8 common species of ants. I use this example because this group includes Wasmannia auropunctata, the little fire ant. The ant in our example right there is not a little fire ant, though. It's Solenopsis abdita, the concealed thief ant. It's an LFA lookalike. So tiny monomorphic red yellow ants. That's the characterization for little fire ants, but we have lots of lookalikes. Okay, moving on. I said this talk was going to be about all the ants of Hawaii. I've left a few out, so I'm going to throw some slides at you real quick to cover my bases. These are the 6 mustache ants or pygmy snapping ants in Hawaii. These ants, I say, are adorable. The drawing on the right, you can see their heart-shaped head. The hairs on some of these ants become bulbous. They're almost like feathers. The ant in picture number 2, you can see it towards its rear end. It's got this weird jelly-like substance attached to it. Why do these ants do that? I have no idea. I can't find any literature on that, but it seems to be something they're really into. These are the pygmy snapping ants. These are our 6 sneaking ants. Again, these are ants that live in low numbers in highly disturbed areas. They're not uncommon. They just don't appear in very large numbers. And we got 6 different species of them. These are our 6 pennant ants in the genus Tetramorium. The photos are not to scale with one another. Specimens 1 and 2 are large ants. Those, again, are lookalikes of the tropical fire ant. But again, they don't really bite or sting. Numbers 3 and 4 are much, much smaller. They are lookalikes of the little fire ant. But again, these are all fairly benign species. Moving on, we got 6 species in the genus Monomorium, or related species. We actually have a 7th one, but we already showed you that picture of the flower ant. These are, for the most part, benign ants. Species number 3, the pharaoh ant, is horribly invasive in parts of the world, but I don't sense that it's causing that sort of drama here in Hawaii. I want to give a shout out to species number 2, Monomorium liliuokalanii. This species was identified and described in 1899 and was named by its describer for our recently overthrown Queen Liliuokalani. Moving on, here are 9 Poneran ants. These are the very primitive ants. These ants bear a striking resemblance to the ancient ants from 100 million years ago that we sometimes find in amber. These ants, as you can see, mostly lack eyes. They live deep in the soil. They have no need for eyes. They rarely see sunlight and live in low numbers. What else can I say? I want to point out, I hope by now, after seeing so many pictures of ants, you can look at these 9 ants and say, wow, they all look sort of similar to each other. I'm going to go back a slide. Look at these ants and compare them to these ants. By now, I hope you're seeing, oh, there's some differences there. There's some physical differences and there's massive biological and behavioral differences. Okay, moving on. We got 4 species of white-footed ants. They're all, the first 3 especially, are incredibly similar. And then this slide, the first 3 are 3 different big-headed ants that we have here in Hawaii. Note that those 3 pictures are not to scale with one another. And then the last 4 on this slide are just 4 random ants that didn't make it anywhere else in my slideshow. So now you have seen all 68 species of ants in Hawaii. Now, if any of this has struck a chord with you and you're thinking, I want to learn more, there's of course lots of YouTube videos about ants, but I also want to give a shout out to some awesome web resources that are created and maintained by professional entomologists. These are non-commercial, clickbait-free websites, and there's 3 of them that I really want to give a shout out to: antmaps.org, antweb.org, and antwiki.org. These 3 are incredibly valuable resources of information. I really want to give a shout out to the first one, antmaps.org. This is a super simple site where you type in the Latin name of a species and it shows you a map of where that species is found. This is the distribution of little fire ants throughout the world. The green in South America and Central America indicate the native range of the species. The brown points are where this ant is invaded. All those green dots around the Mediterranean, these are new, really new records of this ant. It seems to be invading the countries around Southern Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. This ant is not done with its invasion of the world. No talk about invasive species would be complete without the invasion curve. Preventing invasive species is the cheapest way of dealing with invasive species. Keep them from walking through the door in the first place. Our Hawaii Department of Agriculture does amazing work at stopping them at the border. That is the cheapest investment, the biggest payoff of investment when it comes to invasive species, that prevention work. If something slips through the cracks, and it will, no system is perfect, then early detection is critical. This is where I work. We work in early detection of invasive species so that we can eradicate them before the cost and distribution of the species gets out of control. By the time the general public is seeing the species on their daily walks or drives to work, things are getting out of hand at that point. At that point, eradication is probably no longer possible. Containment might be an option, but as you can see, it's already getting really expensive. If we mess up on the containment, we hit a point of no return where the costs are so exorbitant, it would take our entire annual budget of the entire state of Hawaii to get rid of a species. And so at that point, we more or less have to give up. There's not much that can be done. So going back to the beginning, prevention, early detection are the keys. What can you do about early detection? You can help with ants, by collecting ants in your yard, sending them in for identification. Throughout the state of Hawaii, go to the website stoptheant.org. There's a button there, click it, get a free home survey kit mailed to you. It teaches you how to collect the ants in your yard and send them in for identification. We encourage everyone in the state of Hawaii to survey their yards at least once a year, and certainly anytime you bring something onto the property that could harbor ants, like potted plants, no matter where you get the potted plants, whether it's from your tutu, from the best nursery on the planet, or something in between. And of course, mulch, wood piles, green waste, anything brought from another island should be checked for ants. We love getting samples from the public, so stoptheant.org. Finally, I want to give a plug out to 643 Pest. This is the reporting method for any invasive species. If you ever see a species that you think that is not supposed to be here, I've never seen it before. I've lived here my whole life, and that species I've never seen. Just take a picture, put a point on a map at 643pest.org, and your report will go to an expert who will make a decision as to what needs to be done, if anything. Again, this is for early detection of brand new invasive species. 643pest.org. Memorize that. You can also call 643pest. Okay. Lastly, if you want more information about invasive species in Hawaii, go to this website, hawaiiinvasivespecies.org. You got links to all the ISCs around the state. We have 5 different invasive species committees on our 5 biggest islands. There's also the Hawaii Invasive Species Council, the coordinating group on alien pest species. These are all outstanding resources to get more information. With that, I'm going to wrap up. Say thank you to my colleagues at MISC, especially Brooke and Taya, and the LFA crew who listened to my ant stories ad nauseum. I want to give a shout out to Alexander Wild, who let me use a lot of his copyrighted photos. Melody at the Hawaii Ant Lab let me use photos. Michelle at Hawaii Ant Lab got me started on this whole journey of ant identification. Ant Web and iNaturalist are loaded with amazing photos. And with that, I'm going to wrap up. And if you have any questions, let's go from there.
Okay, Monty. I can go ahead and start reading these out loud if you wanted to answer.
Yeah.
Cameron has asked if there's what potential indicators there might be between tropical field or tropical fire ant and RIFA that are helpful in the field based on behavior and habitat.
So that's an excellent question. RIFA and tropical fire ants are very different in the field. Once RIFA has firmly established itself and the nest is several years old, you will have ant hills that could be up to 2 or 3 feet tall, which is like nothing we've ever seen in Hawaii. If you get attacked by an ant on your feet, it's going to be a much more physically miserable experience with RIFA than with tropical fire ants. I guess those are the 2 main indicators of the 2. Again, there's a little bit of arbitrariness to it. I would encourage anyone who's ever stung by a fire ant on their feet, get a sample, send it in, and then we can make sure it's really just tropical fire ants and not the incipient stages of a red imported fire ant.
Yes, I would second having not being an ant expert, but having been stung by both species. RIFA is much worse. Let's see. Cameron also asked what parts of Hawaii might be best to look through the soil to find the cute soil-dwelling ants, and what tools and methods are you collecting those soil ants?
Yeah, that's a good question. And unfortunately, I don't have a great answer to that. Whenever I see some of those cool soil-dwelling ants, it's because they accidentally got trapped in our ant traps that we use for surface-dwelling ants. We use peanut butter in little plastic vials, and maybe 1 out of every 10,000 ants that we catch is one of those weird soil-dwelling ants. Collecting soil-dwelling species is a little more labor-intensive, involving collecting samples of soil and picking out the ants, or having the ants separated using a heat lamp and getting them to crawl out. I would say the more diverse a forest is, whether it's an invasive forest or native forest, that's where you're most likely to find these weird soil-dwelling species. They require a healthy soil ecosystem, whether it's native or non-native. They need other soil-dwelling critters. So like a dry parking lot, dirt parking lot, that's not where I'd look. I'd look in a moist forest first.
And then someone asked if you have any recommendation for controlling ants that are farming the plant pests, so aphids and mealybugs.
So yeah, I've a couple things. First, if we find out exactly what species, that might help. So collecting some of the ants and sending them in to your local ISC for identification, that can help get you a much better answer. But there are numerous ways to control ants. the Hawaii Ant Lab, whose website is littlefireants.com, has a special web page on ant control. And it goes into detail about all sorts of different treatment possibilities. There are a number of very common pesticides in the, at your garden shops and hardware stores that work on a great majority of our ants, but some ants are kind of, what do you say, their appetites are finicky and they don't always eat the bait. And so if you have one of those ants, you might need some special instructions. Most hardware stores have a very straightforward Amdro fire ant bait. That's a very generic bait designed for REFA, but it works on most species of ants. So without any further information, that's what I would use if I was having problems. But again, you got to read the labels, make sure it's suitable for crops, that sort of thing. Not all pesticides are appropriate to use in areas where you're raising food crops. And so there's some other questions that need to be answered to give a really good answer to your question. I hope that helps. Oh, can't hear you.
Thank you. So this is something people have asked me. If carpenter ants are not eating your wood in your house and causing damage, what are they eating?
That's a good question. And I couldn't cite a study that specifically talks about our species of carpenter ant. There are a lot of carpenter ants on the mainland that do chew through the wood to make their tunnels. And even those ants, though, I don't think are eating the wood. They're just creating their chambers. The carpenter ant in Hawaii, for the most part, it uses chambers that were built by other things, by beetles or termites, that sort of thing. If they push anything out of their tunnel, out through your wall, it's most likely just debris. They're cleaning stuff up. They're not causing additional damage. What they're eating, that's a good question. There's a lot of little tiny insects that burrow into wood and into our walls, especially in tropical places like Hawaii. I don't think it's out of the question to suggest that what they're eating was worse than the ants themselves. And so maybe the ants should be welcome. That might be going out on a limb there. But I imagine they're a scavenger. They eat other dead insects. They may hunt live insects. They may eat the larvae of other insects that are in your walls. That's a good question, and I wish I had a better answer.
So thank goodness for termites to make habitat for carpenter ants. So what Cameron was asking, what ants in Hawaii make mounds?
Make mounds? That is also a good question. There's not a lot of ants that make mounds in Hawaii. Tropical fire ants make very tiny mounds. The biggest one I've ever seen was maybe 2 inches high, and maybe 6 or 8 inches across. So if you see a mound that's significantly bigger than that, that's when you start worrying that this might be red imported fire ant. Other ants that make significant soil disturbances, whether it's sometimes it's like a circular mound, sometimes it's more of a line in the ground. The big-headed ants do that. African big-headed ants, especially, I see that all the time. Some of the pennant ants in the genus Tetramorium, I've seen them push soil up through cracks in pavement, and it creates a little round circle of dirt, maybe an inch or so across. Barely counts as a mound, but the largest mounds of any ant in Hawaii would be the tropical fire ant. And again, maybe an inch or two high.
That looks like all the questions that we have right now. I'm
Okay.
going to put up one last before you leave. I'm going to put up one more poll. And So if you could take a few minutes to fill this out before you leave, and if you have any more questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A for Monty.
And if you don't get a chance, or if you think of a question later, my email was there somewhere, but it's a really simple email address, mwtl@hawaii.edu. I love getting ant questions, so feel free to email me anytime. I feel weird sitting here all silent, so if you're still there, thank you for attending. I really appreciate it.
Yep, thank you. There's other events. Let's see. Next week is very anti. There is Monday evening, there's a summary of the situation on Oahu. And then Tuesday at 1 o'clock, you can hear from Brooke Mencken. He no longer has his handlebar mustache that looks sort of like a monkey. But yeah, he'll be talking about the situation in Nihiku and what we've done there. And then on the 23rd is a talk with all of the dog handlers throughout the state and their work on CRB and everything else that's going on, as well as Trisha Wilson, who is our little fire ant handler for our new little fire ant dog. Or excuse me, our little fire ant dog handler. She handles little fire ants too, but only by accident. All right, it looks like everybody has answered. So mahalo. Let me see, there's one more question that came in. Yep, just thank you. All right. Thank you all. And yeah, be sure to check out Who's Stop Happening the rest of the month.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Aloha.